In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the afterword to the education of Augie Merasty, residential school memoir. And the afterword of the book, it's the chapter right after the conclusion. And this afterword is written by David Carpenter. So again, we return to David Carpenter as the narrator. He wrote the introduction to the book as well. And so his introduction and afterward act almost like a frame narrative or bookends for Augie's inset story of what he went through as a child at the residential school. But by including these narrated chapters by David Carpenter, we learn a little bit more about Augie's life in the present and how some of the struggles that he has as an adult and as a senior, he's in his late 70s, I think, at this point, in 2014 when Carpenter wrote this chapter. He would have been, again, in his late 70s. He was suffering from very poor health. He still had mental health issues. He falls off the wagon and struggles with sobriety. And then we also learn on top of these things, he's been homeless and, has a very kind of unstable lifestyle. So David Carpenter gives us that information about Augie, and we're able to, as readers, connect some of these problems that Augie has in his life back to the childhood trauma that we just read about. So we connect past and present, and we understand more and have more empathy and sympathy for Augie and where he's at and who he is, because now we know what he's been through. So I think we're meant to connect and see the connection between the trauma that he experienced as a child and then how his life has been forever holding the consequences of that past. And we can also connect things like his drinking or his homelessness, struggles with depression. Those are all things that we can also associate maybe with historical trauma or even PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're symptoms of this larger trauma that he experienced. And we can have a little bit of empathy or understanding of why he's got these problematic behaviors. So the afterword begins, it says on June 2014. And if you remember back, the introduction chapter started on 2001. So it did take a long time from the moment that Augie reached out to David Carpenter in 2001 to 2014. So 13 years later is when the contract to the book is finally ready to be signed and the book's ready to be published. So it took 13 years for this book to be created. And again, it's a reflection of how Augie's life was it could easily have fallen off the tracks. And there were even points where David Carpenter thought Augie had died because he had no contact with him for multiple years. But it is due to the resilience of both Augie and to David Carpenter that this book got made. So together they were able to create something meaningful. And I think, if neither one of these men were involved with this project, again, it would have never been made, I think. We could say that. So David Carpenter talks about in the afterword that he'd been given the task of locating Augie so that Augie could sign the contract for the memoir to be published. But this sounds easier than it is because Augie is very hard to track down, and he doesn't really have a permanent address. And it turns out that he had been living in Prince Albert, but he has no address, in Prince Albert. So David Carpenter has to kind of track him down going to Prince Albert, driving around, asking people if they've seen Augie, and basically like just through word of mouth trying to figure out where he is. And he tries to find Augie. That fails. So he tries to make a second trip to Prince Albert to look for Augie. And he learns that he was recently at the Indian Métis Friendship Center. And she suggested that he phone the detox center where Augie has been known to stay. David Carpenter describes Augie almost like a figure in a dream who dissolves before you can talk to him. And he talks a little bit about Augie in a dream that he's had. And he says Augie's almost like a shapeshifter. He says, like the Greek god Proteus, he kept changing his shape from human to animal. This is on page 69. When at last I ran him down, he was crouched in a dark corner, small as a rodent, afraid to look up at me. He began to melt like an ice carving before my eyes. I called his name, but all that was left was a puddle of water. So this is a dream that David Carpenter has, and he imagines Augie as if he were this human who changed into the shape of an animal and who's running away from David, hiding, and then he's also an ice carving that melts and turns into a puddle of water. So kind of a weird abstract imagery of David's dream. But it could tell us a little bit about how he views Augie as almost fearful at this point of time, where maybe he doesn't want the manuscript to get made, or he's maybe fearful that he's going to be exposing and being made vulnerable on a public audience when he does get published. So there could be something like that. I'm not sure exactly, though. It's kind of abstract imagery. There is maybe a theme of dehumanization there as well, that Augie changing his shape from human to animal does suggest that there's maybe, the acknowledgement that Augie has been treated almost worse than an animal has in his residential school experience, where the children were dehumanized. David ends up trying to meet Augie at the detox center, but he makes plans with Augie to meet him there, but he doesn't show up, or Augie doesn't show up, and we learn that the young man who works at the detox center tells David that Augie's still drinking and that he lives on the street, and because of that he's very unpredictable and hard to pin down. So eventually the detox center is able to hold Augie for some time until David comes up and meets with him and gets the signature. And when they finally meet up, David Carpenter reflects on Augie because he's known him now for over a decade, and he's met him only, once or twice in that time face to face. But they've interacted with the letter writing back and forth, and they've interacted with a few phone calls. But he says he describes Augie, who in this scene is wearing a white hospital robe, and he's wearing pajamas. So he's been at the detox center all night, so he's wearing the clothes of the detox center, which is basically like a hospital robe. And Augie's described as a shrunken version of the Augie I had met a decade ago in the bar. We approached each other and shook hands. Augie says, I'm a little hungover. And his face is described as booze-racked and scarred, but tough, determined, and observant. This is on page 70. So obviously he shows a lifetime of, alcohol abuse on his face. There's scars, and it's, he doesn't look that healthy. But there's this other part of Augie that shines through, being tough, determined, and observant. So all of the characteristics that we see in Augie as an author and memoirist. He's been tough, his resilience, determined and observant in his writing. So he tells David that he's also been ill. So he says, I got the prostate cancer. I don't have a long time to live. He's also in a bad mood. He's very impatient and grumpy the entire conversation. David ends up giving Augie some money for a cab, and he says Augie's gone back downtown, back to the street, back to the drinking that doomed and sustained him each day. So they part ways, but there is this moment of recognition and appreciation that they have for each other as the culmination of this book project. David also realizes that the people at the detox center purposefully kept Augie's clothes away from him and made him wear the pajamas so they could hold him there for longer, just so he wouldn't leave before David got there. So they were working, essentially to help Augie get to sign these contracts, even though it annoyed Augie to be left without his clothes. And at that very last moment, David reflects on Augie and says he would get back to the desolate comfort of boozing, but perhaps he would be buoyed by the knowledge that his book was coming out. At that moment, Augie had reverted to the intelligent man on a quest that I had first known. He was both men, the hopeless alcoholic facing senility, and the cheerful warrior and backwoods philosopher. So there is a final reflection and an acknowledgement that Augie is both of those people at the same time. He's both men. He is hopelessly alcoholic and also facing senility, and his life is coming to an end with poor health. But at the same time, he's shown such resilience, and he is that cheerful warrior and backwoods philosopher that he has shown in his writing. So that duality really captures Augie's personality. And then David his final words in the text is that Augie was no longer a fleeting vision, a character that vanishes in a dream. He was right there in front of me, as big as life, bigger than life, more than just a man, more like a hero. So we can contemplate that last line, that Augie is more than a man, more like a hero, and contemplate why or how we can see Augie as a heroic figure. And I would say, in my own opinion anyway, that, he's heroic for many reasons. One of them is the fact that he's shared his story, which again is very vulnerable and an intimate portrayal of what he went through. And it's not easy to share that kind of information with the world. So he's done a heroic, courageous act by sharing his voice and story of childhood trauma with the world. And he's educated us, the audience, in ways that we never knew before. We learned intimate details about the abuse that he and other students experienced. And I don't think I've ever read a book that's, depicted abuse in such, graphic detail, but it's powerful in that way. And also showing the connection between his present and the flaws of his character being shown is also showing that he's vulnerable and exposing himself to the world. In David Carpenter's portrayal of him, his struggles with sobriety. So it allows us to sort of empathize and see the connection between his childhood and the struggles he has in the present. So all these things I think are heroic. It's helping us understand what the residential school system entailed, the truth of what really occurred there. And it also helps educate us as readers to have a little bit more empathy and understanding of people who are going through struggles in their present life, and maybe see them as, people who are stuck or struggling because of things that have happened to their past. We need to have a little bit more empathy and compassion for people, and maybe not judge people just on surface impressions. And we also need to also expand who we're reading, right? Who gets to be the author? Who tells the stories? So by giving Augie Merasty a platform, a voice that maybe would never have heard before, or would be likely to overlook or not listen to, by giving him a voice through this book, it really does open our eyes and our perspective to acknowledge, his struggle and the struggles of other residential school survivors and their families. So those are my thoughts, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about Augie as a hero.